session today is designed to give you an overview about what I think behavioral science can do to help you in the implementation of the NDCs. Let me see, here we go. And I'll give you a few introductory remarks on what I see as a challenge in this particular domain of decision-making and action. And then we switch to the NDCs. And as I said, this talk is not designed to give you insight in a lot of the tools, but I will give you some examples of those. And then together in the discussion afterwards, we can decide on how to proceed in the future and what more information is needed. There also are references to any of the topics that I mentioned at the end of my presentation. But let's start by saying that we've called our current time the Anthropocene to denote the fact that it's increasingly behavior and decisions that humans make, and in particular decisions that we make with respect to energy use, energy technologies that is shaping our physical and social environment. And the bottom line is we're not doing very well. We are exceeding planetary boundaries, both on livable climate and biodiversity, but also on 5 of the 7 other dimensions identified by PIC, while leaving large portions of the human population behind. They are growing in obscene income and wealth inequalities, energy access inequities, both within and between countries. Challenges are well documented. We know where the problems lie, and we also know where the solutions lie. UN Sustainable Development Goals pinpoint, areas for action, and also the IPCC reports that come out every 5 to 7 years tell us, what are climate change mitigation and adaptation solutions, both from a supply and from a demand side. A few years ago, when COVID-19 came on, the climate community thought, well, maybe we can learn something about communicating and motivating climate action from seeing how we do with respect to the coronavirus. Turns out we didn't do so well on the corona front as well. And I think the reason is that the challenges for these two societal risks are very similar. They're both global issues that require national and international cooperation. Rapid government and corporate responses. They require massive behavior change, and all have upfront costs, certain upfront costs, to avoid negative future outcomes that oftentimes are delayed in time, but also probabilistic and uncertain. Not a good recipe for action. They have differential risks and impacts as a function of demographic and socioeconomic and geographic political dimensions. And the nature of the threat is, to most of us, unobservable, to most of us largely unknown in detail. It needs to be communicated with complex scientific models and has an exponential pace of growth, which makes the delay of action ever more so serious. So what do we assume in all of these decisions that we talked about the decision maker? Well, the ruling assumption in economics and in political science has been one of rational updating and rational choice. We're dealing with Homo economicus. I oftentimes wish we were dealing with Homo economicus. We wouldn't be in the trouble that we're in right now in dealing with societal challenges. But perceptions and comprehensions of human beings, of Homo sapiens, are in the policy context mostly considered ex post, for marketing of climate policies, for explaining certain types of failures. Helena mentioned the IPCC, that it took it to the 5th assessment report to even include a psychologist here on its panel. There were more moral philosophers than psychologists. And also, it was only in the 5th assessment report, 25 years after the beginning of this enterprise, that we even mentioned non-rational decision processes. In fact, we had to smuggle it in a chapter on risk management in 2014. Fortunately, there was actually some rapid uptake and appreciation of the contributions of psychological models of decision making. And in the 6th assessment report, we actually had a chapter 12 on demand, services, and social aspects of mitigation that extensively, covered the demand side of climate change mitigation and adaptation, but also methods of bringing about greater both mitigation success and adaptation success by incorporating a broader view of the human decision maker. So what should you know about Homo sapiens, about us, about the human decision maker? Well, we are subject to finite attention and finite processing capacity, unlike the assumption of Homo economicus. And if we only have so much attention and processing capacity to go around, we have to husband it carefully. What's more important than here and now and us? And so that gives rise to myopia and status quo bias. We basically like things the way they are, and we focus on the here and now, and have a hard time thinking about sort of future consequences and future risks. We also have many goals, often conflicting ones. So we're not just focused on selfish utility maximization. We also have other regarding goals. And in addition to material goals, we have psychological goals. We want to feel confident in our decisions. And oftentimes, these goals contradict each other in terms of action. And here it's important to know that goals need to be activated to play a role in a decision. And so a lot of the psychological tools have to do with goal activation by changing the context, by changing the way questions are being formulated or asked. We also evaluate outcomes in a relative fashion. A certain outcome is not good or bad in its own right. It's always compared to what. And compared to what gives us, again, tools for action, for changing people's perception by changing the reference point that people are using. We are tribal, essentially. We're committed to our convictions and what our tribe, what our community believes is true. And so that, in that sense, believing is seeing. What we believe oftentimes influences our perceptions of reality. So we oftentimes live in parallel universes. And at the same time, seeing is also believing, in the sense that we learn best by trial and error, by getting hurt, but getting the emotional impact of what it's like to be in a certain situation or not. Last and most importantly, perhaps, is we have multiple ways of making decisions. Yes, we make decisions by calculating costs and benefits, but oftentimes we just don't follow our head, we follow our heart, we follow feelings, or we follow rules of conduct. And as an example of sort of how we approach these, how we establish these kinds of facts, let me just sort of give you a little sort of mini module on decision modes. And so, as I said, there are basically three ways in which humans make decisions, oftentimes based on our feelings, our immediate emotional reactions or gut feelings, being engaged by something or being scared by something. Dictates our actions, and that is an automatic and very fast response. Yes, we do make calculation-based decisions. Our prefrontal cortex is an evolutionary accomplishment that allows us to weigh costs and benefits, not just now, but into the future. But that requires cognitive effort. We have to have the capacity for that, and also training. We have the hardware for it, but we have to send our kids to college, to sort of, to learn the software to do it correctly. But then a third and important way of making decisions is role-based. We use social norms or other rules of conduct, standard operating procedures, moral rules of conduct to guide our action. That is a very prevalent and also a very fast way of making decisions. Now, they're all operating in parallel. They're actually mediated by different parts of the brain, and they don't necessarily all lead to the same conclusion. Most of the time they do. And then we make that decision in a very confident manner without even being aware of having these different voices in our heads. But other times, they might dictate different decisions. And so one study we did with customers of utilities, both in California and in Switzerland. We gave these customers a choice between a standard power option, which was well described, much more than in this graphic, but different ways of generating the power and a certain cost, or between a green power option with different power generation modes and costing something like 20% more per month. Then we asked customers which they would prefer. And as you can see, green power is quite popular. 2/3 of customers in both countries across the political spectrum, incidentally, sort of chose the green, more expensive power. But then we also asked them after they made the decision to indicate on a 10-point scale to what extent they either had used a calculation-based mode, and we explained to them what that meant in quite detail, or an emotion-based mode. And again, we explained that to them, and they judged it on a scale from 1 to 10, or a rule-based mode. Then you can run a regression that sort of basically says, sort of what did this person decide as a function of how much he or she indicated they used their head, they used their heart, or they did things by the book for this particular decision. And what the regression told us, again, in both countries, was that the more individuals utility customers used their head to make the decision, used the calculation-based mode, the less likely were they to choose green electricity, but the more likely they were to use either their heart or make decisions by some social rule of conduct. They were more likely than to use green electricity. So modes influences decisions as a function of context. Okay. Let's also talk a little bit about whose decisions we are talking. And what I want to argue is we're talking about everyone's decisions. That includes not just citizens, people as citizens or consumers. It also includes policymakers. It includes managers. It includes everyone. Some people, some groups are easier to study, and the general public is easiest to study. But all phenomena and processes that I will discuss really apply to everyone. Maybe to different degrees as a function of professional training. I talked about the fact that rational decisions, calculation-based decisions have to be learned to some extent. They don't come natural. They're not bred in the bone. But the general takeaway from everything I say today applies to everyone and should be considered for everyone. Economics considers non-rational decision processes as indicating some deficit. It's the absence of perfect information about all choice options, or the absence of infinite attentional or processing capacity that they're dealing with in the view of economics. So rationality becomes bounded rationality, bounded by material and by cognitive constraints. And that suggests that if there aren't rational decisions, there might be an information deficit as a cause of non-optimal choices. Psychology takes a very different perspective, one of abundance. It suggests that we have more goals than just self-interested material goals. We have more decision processes than just calculations of costs and benefits. And these greater number of goals and greater decision processes give us more entry points to inform, to educate, and to influence decisions. And also some opportunity for psychological jujitsu, where the processes that give rise to maybe non-optimal decisions can also be used in a redesign of the decision process to make decisions more optimal. So now, before we start our discussion, let me sort of give you some behavioral science targets and tools that we can maybe use going into the future to talk about some of the challenges that you see in the implementation of NDC 3.0. So I think an important goal is to redirect attention of decision makers. From maybe too much focus on the here and now, too much focus on the status quo, to more forward-looking goals and processes. How do we do that? We can introduce relevant comparisons that gets to the compared to what element, and prospect theory that you might have heard about, because Danny Kahneman won a Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for that in 2002, sort of shows us the way. We can also prompt early processing of typically neglected choice options, for example, sort of forward-looking future options, by correcting the myopia of focusing on first on the here and now and on us. And their query theory, which was actually developed by me and a co-author, sort of points the way. We can redirect attention by activating relevant values, often by eliciting appropriate decision modes. If you want people to consider social norms of conduct, then making it more likely that people will use rule-based decisions rather than calculation-based decisions is one way of doing that. And we can also do it by using social expectations, by utilizing or creating some social norms. Another area of intervention of work would be to build trust. Helena already mentioned the trust deficit, that we all see. We see it in our work a lot. I do a lot of work on net zero, the transition to renewable infrastructures, energy infrastructures at Princeton, at the Andinger Center for Energy and Environment. We had a workshop last June where we brought together experts in the field in cooperation with Worley, which is an engineering systems and services company, a global company. And there we had something like 50 or 60 experts rating what they saw either as the ideal level of trust between different stakeholders, asset owners meaning energy assets, and financiers, for example, or developers of these assets, and labor or community leaders. And the ideal level is black, a high level of trust is seen as desirable, but current levels of trust are in gray. And you see huge discrepancies, for example, between developers and community leaders, trust between asset owners and community leaders, or developers and laborers. There's no question that there's not enough trust in this world. So how do we deal with this existing and growing trust deficit, which also often is quite accurately based on past violations of trust? So how do we deal with that? We can activate and create superordinate common goals or common enemies. Hiding the common enemy becomes the common goal. We can utilize and follow through on costly signals of trustworthiness to build trust, using trusted, genuine leaders, or utilizing trusted messengers, or implementing genuine consultative processes and maximal transparencies, bringing relevant stakeholders together early and repeatedly to discuss their fears, hopes, and expectations in safe settings. I think the last point of action that I want to bring up today is encourage action on climate, both mitigative and adaptive action in face of pervasive status quo bias. I'm oftentimes surprised that anything changes in this world because we are so focused on thinking about what's good about what we have. The UN, of course, has talked about from ambition to action, highlighting policy, finance, solutions, and engagements as critical elements. And I think especially the last two, solutions and engagements, sort of have lots of room for behavioral science interventions, how to accelerate the delivery and scale up proven action across sectors, and how to engage whole of society and country ownership. And we do something actually very similar in our work with Worley, this engineering services firm I talked about. They have a nice series of reports from ambition to reality. It's illustrated sort of on the right-hand side. So there are 5 critical elements. And again, you might want to look at reference, and we can talk about it down the road. What these different components are. But let me just sort of mention before we close on some behavioral barriers to action. The biggest one contributed to status quo bias is probably the fear of change. The devil we know is what we have, and sort of future societal or technological or economic changes, sort of might bring dangers that we're not aware of. But oftentimes the fear of these sort of future negative consequences is much bigger ex ante before the change is implemented than it's being found by stakeholders afterwards. And that suggests that making change experimental, making it just on a trial basis, or starting with a small amount of change that then gradually scales up, is one way of dealing with these somewhat irrational fears. There's also the fear of being the sucker in a situation, in a game theoretic context. But building coalitions and using altruistic punishment is one way of dealing with that. There's a single action bias, and that's especially true when an action is being triggered by fear or by guilt, by negative emotions, where we do one thing and then the signal that we had, the fear or guilt goes down because nobody wants to be in this negative mood state for a long period of time. It's very aversive. And so the first opportunity that we have, sort of brings the flag down, which then means that we leave other actions on the table. Oftentimes a portfolio of action is what's called for in these complex risk situations. And so negative emotions might get people's attention initially, but in the long run, they're actually quite dysfunctional. And the pride in being part of the solution motivates more and much longer than the guilt of being part of the problem. So there's also a tension between sort of speed and scope of change about what's needed in the context of meeting these challenges. Net zero, for example, by 2050. This is a map of our project that shows how much infrastructure development there has to be in Appalachia, a region of the United States. And it's when you look at these maps and compare them with what exists right now in terms of solar or wind or pipelines, you say, how are we going to get there? A huge amount of infrastructure change is needed, but also a huge amount of change in people's beliefs, attitudes, values, and behavior is also needed. So I think we have to think about not just political and economic change, but also psychological change. So how can behavioral science facilitate the implementation of these NDCs? I would suggest that we need to develop a roadmap to final mitigation, adaptation, or other goals that includes realistic technological, economic, political, social, and psychological assumptions, understanding psychological hurdles to new technology adoption and social behavioral change, to resolve the tension between this need for rapid change and the need for societal consultation. And sort of one of the mottos that we have in our work with Worley is change at the speed of trust. Trust is a central element in all of this, and how to build and rebuild trust in ways that go beyond just lip service. And then lastly, to overcome and circumvent hurdles by traditional policy tools, but also by choice architecture. That means changes in the way choice options are presented, and by changes in the social and economic context in which they're made. So can behavioral science contribution save the world? No, certainly not single-handedly, but behavioral science insights and tools can powerfully multiply supply-side innovation, economic incentives, and legal mandates. So I want to